Well, hello again and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now today we've made the journey from central Scotland to the border town of Lockerbie for the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's Round 3 event in their 2021 championship. Now we're at Cumstone Farm in Lockerbie, but this is a brand new track to what we're normally used to, so we're looking forward to seeing the bikes in action in this brand new track. Now we will have classes from pre-1968 up to pre-1975, and also we will of course have the twin shock or pre-1984 class taking part as well. So quite a good entry of riders for this Round 3 event here at Cumstone Farm. Now the forecast for today is not too good, unfortunately. It's a heavy rain forecast, so as the day goes on we may see one of those old style muddy scrambles if the weather turns out to be as forecast, but hopefully not, and we'll hopefully see a good day's racing from all the classes. Okay, just before we get down to the racing, let's just take a quick walk around the paddock and just check out some of these nice bikes that's soon to take part in this Round 3 event here at Cumstone Farm in Lockerbie. Okay, our first bike is Ian Ward's 1966 250 Villiers. Now this is not a fully blown original bike from that year, as it's made up of various other different parts of Villiers bikes, but this has been a very reliable old bike for Ian, and he's had it for some years now, and it's served him quite well without any major issues with the mechanicals. But Ian says that this is very much a work in progress kind of bike, as he's constantly changing and swapping parts that he think might improve the bike's handling or the running of that Villiers motor. Now Ian also has a 4-stroke BSA, and these front forks are from Ian's BSA bike, and he swapped the front end of his Villiers machine onto the BSA because he thought that the front end from the BSA might suit this Villiers a little better. Now the motor is a standard 250 Villiers engine, although this again is a mix of parts from the Villiers 32A and 36A engines. Now the fuel tank, as I remember, was originally fitted to a little RM Suzuki motorcycle, but it certainly appears to fit on Ian's Villiers bike quite neatly, as you can see. But this entire bike of Ian's is still a decent little racer, and Ian competes on this bike in the pre-1968 class, and these old Villiers motors are very similar to the old Greaves power plants from that same 1960s era. But as I said, a very good, solid, reliable machine. So that's a very quick look at Ian Ward's 1966 Villiers. Now this next bike is another example of those very popular CZ twin shockers, and the actual name of the rider for this bike escapes me at the moment, but again another lovely example of one of these very quick Czechoslovakian twin shock racers. Now the rider was telling me on the day that the bike should have an aluminium fuel tank fitted to the frame, although this part of the bike was away at a specialist's being repaired, so he's had to fit this makeshift plastic substitute in its place. Now again, this bike's fitted with the usual gear shift modifications, which helps to almost eliminate that long throw associated with the CZ gearbox, and also a nice pair of these MDR jaggy foot pegs to replace the original skinny CZ ones. Now again, a nice set of Falcon rear shocks on this bike, and an upgraded replacement exhaust expansion chamber, which again are very popular parts to replace on these CZs. and yet more modifications again to the cylinder barrel, with every second fin being removed, which could either be just to reduce the weight of the bike or to improve the motor's cooling, but the jury's still undecided as to why this particular modification is done on these older CZs. But looking at these MDR foot pegs, your foot's never going to slip off these little beauties, which of course are top quality alloy replacements. Now again, as you can see, these older Falta replicas had that big leather retaining strap to hold what would have been an alloy tank originally, but there's quite a few original period correct parts on this bike, and these old CZs, or CZs if you like, they still make a good starter bike if you want to get into vintage racing, because there are plenty of them out there, and spare parts and upgrades are in plentiful supply for these older twin shockers. But as I said, this is a nice example and a quick bike as well, as you'll get the chance to see this bike on the track when I post the racing footage from this round 3 event at Lockerbie in the next video here on my YouTube channel. But of course, this was just one of the very nice bikes that were taking part in this round 3 event at Lockerbie. Okay, next up we're going to take a quick look at Mike van der Meer's CR125 Honda Evolution bike, and Mike will be racing this bike in the brand new 1989 Evolution 125 class at this event. Now I have to say that there weren't too many of these little 125 bikes at this particular round 3 meeting, and because this is of course a brand new class that the club have introduced for 2021, so we could certainly do with more machines turning up in this class. So if you've got an old pre-1989 bike, 125 bike lying around in the garage somewhere, then why not dig it out and give it a race with the Scottish Classic Racing Club in a future race meeting sometime. But despite their small size, these are still highly competitive little bikes, these 125s, and if it's a tight and twisty track and with a good rider in the saddle, these CR125s can hold their own against bigger and more powerful race bikes. Now, as you can see here, a plastic brake disc guard just to protect the brake from stones and other debris that would otherwise damage it. But although these CR125s don't have the horsepower of their bigger brothers, they are certainly quick and nimble through the corners, and what they actually lack in outright grunt, they can more than usually make up for in terms of their handling and quickness through the twisty parts of the circuit. But once again, this is another bike to look out for when you see the racing footage from this event coming up in part 2. Okay, next up we're going to take a look at one of the pre-1984 bikes that will be racing at Lockerbie for this round 3 event, and this is John Crawford's Twin Shock 500 Honda. Now this is another of those hybrid Hondas with the rear twin shock conversion and of course a later Honda motor in the chassis. Now normally it's a Honda monoshock frame that's been converted for twin shock racing, and then a later water cooled 500 Honda motors bottom end is then used with an air cooled barrel and cylinder head on the top. Now in this shot you can see here where the water pump would have been on the end of the crankshaft, which is then just removed and blanked off, as of course it's no longer required. But this is now a very common modification on these hybrid Hondas, and as you'd expect, They're pretty fast and of course still fully eligible to race in the pre-1984 class due to the bike having twin shock rear suspension, front and rear drum brakes, and of course more importantly that air-cooled two-stroke motor. But this is certainly a big brute of a bike, and you can see John racing this machine in the pre-1984 class in of course the next video posting, which will be all the racing from this round 3 event. Now, as you'd expect, these big 500s are not the kind of bike for your average club rider, as they're certainly a bit of a handful and not the easiest of bikes to throw around a racetrack. But the wide open layout of this new Lockerbie racetrack should certainly suit this big monster, and of course John's flamboyant riding style. But another big open class twin shock racer, that's John Crawford's 500 Honda. Now moving on, this is Darrell Wiley's Honda 250 four-stroker, and Darrell and his family have quite a good selection of these 4 bangers at this round 3 event, and this featured example I think is Darrell's number 1 race bike. Now once again, this is quite a rare machine, and you certainly don't see many of these 250s now used as classic scramblers these days, but Darrell's certainly used this bike for quite some time now, and it appears to be quite quick and very reliable, as of course you'd expect from any Honda motorcycle. Now it's a single cylinder 2-valve motor, as you no doubt know, and I think this is also a C and J frame in this particular bike. Well, it has it stamped on the swing arm, which is surely a bit of a giveaway really, but quite a long pair of shocks at the rear on this bike, probably fitted just to suit Darrell's tall stature, but it still looks like there's plenty travel in those rear shocks just to soak up any bumps that Darrell will come across on this Lockerbie racetrack. But of course it's still a nice looking old 4-stroke racer, and this of course is just one of 3 Hondas that the family have brought along to this round 3 event, and this particular race bike of Darrell's will be the machine that will more than likely be used over the course of the day. Now in this shot we're taking a look at 2 of the other Team Wiley bikes. Now I don't have any details at all of their motors or frames, but they certainly do look like a similar setup to Darrell's other machines, but it appears that Darrell and his dad Davey certainly like their 4-strokers with these 3 lovely prepared bikes, and I know Darrell's dad Davey occasionally takes to the track on one of these bikes, so who knows, maybe today will be that day that Davey gets a run out on one of his nice little Hondas. But I have to say, certainly a nice looking little threesome of 4-stroke Hondas from the Team Wiley racing stable, and you'll of course be able to see at least one of these little beauties take to the track when you check out part 2 of the racing from this event. Okay, our next bike is another nice looking 370 Spanish Bultaco. Now I'm not really sure who actually owned this bike on the day, but it's still good to see these old Spanish Bultos. It's still being used at vintage race events because they're getting a bit rarer to see these days, and going by the mud and dirt on this particular bike, the owners seems to have already had a bit of an impromptu practice prior to taking part in this Lockerbie event, and these clips were filmed very early in the morning, and that was even before practice got underway. Now, as you know, these Bultaco Pursangs were the real deal during the heydays of the 1970s, and they were highly competitive when the likes of Jim Pomeroy was flying around the racetracks of the world winning Grand Prix events. Now, as I recall, these Bultacos had fiberglass fuel tanks, and there was certainly no question about them being quick, because with the right rider in the saddle and the bike set up and dialed into a particular racetrack, a top-class pilot could still put you on the podium riding one of these 370s, and it is a bit of a shame that these old Bultacos are getting few and far between these days, trying to spot them at vintage race events, and thankfully there are still one or two of these bikes still racing, just to try and keep that Bultaco name in the spotlight. Although I have to say that this number 133 example here certainly looks in excellent original condition, and it appears to have many of the right period correct parts fitted to it, except of course for those replacement YSS rear shocks, which of course is got to be expected on a bike that's more than likely about 40 years old now, but it's still a nice looking example, and as I said, it's just good to still see the Spanish Bultaco name still being represented at these kind of classic and vintage race meetings. Now, next up, it's the turn of Mark Watson and his quite nice looking twin shock CZ. Now, this is another good example of one of these Czechoslovakian CZ race bikes, and if there ever was a make or model that's increasing in popularity at these kind of vintage scrambles over the last 10 years, and it has to be these twin shock CZs. Now, I don't think that Mark's machine is a fully original bike, as it has a couple of different parts from the original CZ design, but these coffin-shaped alloy tanked bikes with that quite unique leather securing strap on the top were supposedly replicas of the great Jaroslav Falta, who of course was a CZ factory racer who raced these CZs for more than 10 years for the Czechoslovakian factory. Although, as I said, these bikes are now hugely popular with classic and vintage racers, and they do make a great starter bike if you want to try your hand at classic racing, because there are plenty of these bikes available for sale, and parts are not really a problem. And of course there are many companies now manufacturing upgrades for these bikes, so there's plenty scope for considering an older CZ if you're looking to get into classic racing. But I have to say that this bike of Mark's is another fine looking bike, and although these CZ motors did have a bit of a reputation as being a bit rattly now and then, there's certainly no shortage of power or speed when you get these two-stroke motors fired up. Although another lovely example of one of these increasingly popular CZ twin-shock bikes, and look out for Mark in action on this particular machine when he takes to the track in the pre-1975 class in Part 2. Now, next up, this was a quite nice but very unusual bike that I spotted at Lockerbie. Now, this is Andrew King's Husqvarna HIS machine, and Andrew told me that this was a bike that he made up of the many spare parts that he had lying around his workshop. Now, essentially, it's an old 1970s Husqvarna frame that's been very slightly modified to take that British-made HIS two-stroke motor. Now, the front forks, Andrew told me, are taken from a Honda and not, of course, HIS or Husqvarna items, but I will do a more in-depth look at this bike in a future video here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, as soon as I of course get all the details of the bike's build and parts from Andrew. And again, as you can see, Andrew's used the original Husqvarna tank for his brand new bike, and he did tell me that he had to alter the bottom part of the Husky frame just to make this HIS motor fit inside, but it all looks like it's been well engineered and bolted together. Now, as you've no doubt guessed, Andrew is a bit of a fan of these HIS Stormer motors, and Andrew already races a similar HIS Stormer in the pre-1968 vintage class. But as I said, it's quite an unusual and interesting machine, and as I said, we'll be taking a closer look at this bike in a future video here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Okay, finally we're going to take a quick look at Andrew Johnston's 1964 Dot Scrambler. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is still an original bike from '64, as Andrew doesn't do modifications or upgraded parts on his race bikes, and he always tries to keep them as near as possible to their original condition. But a lovely looking vintage time capsule, this old Dot, or devoid of trouble, as their abbreviation tended to suggest, but nonetheless another classic British made bike with that well proven Villiers motor inside the frame. Now, of course, it's not just Andrew's Dot Scrambler that's nostalgic here. The vehicle that tows his ancient trailer is an old 1989 MG Metro that has over 133,000 miles on the clock, and it must be one of the last surviving Metros that are still on the road. And even this trailer is 54 years old and was made way back in 1967, so if you're into your motor memorabilia, then this is quite a nostalgic package with the 1964 bike, that ancient 1989 Metro, and of course that original bike trailer from 1967. So just looking at these items together makes you look like you've been transported back in time. And so there you have it, a nice little piece of history with these three automotive items. Well, I hope you enjoyed that quite brief walk around the paddock at this brand new track here at Cumstone Farm in Lockerbie. And don't forget, if you subscribe to my channel, you can see all of these bikes in action on the track when I post the racing videos, which will be coming up shortly. Okay, in a couple of days' time we will be on the move once again, and this time we'll be packing our bags to head to Northern Ireland to cover the charity scramble event at Cecil Pearson's lovely racetrack over there at Ballysala Road. So we'll have a full 2 days of racing, and of course a lot of those very nice Irish vintage race machines as well. So please subscribe to my channel in order that you don't miss out on any of that excellent footage from Northern Ireland. But once again, thanks for joining us here at round 3 at Lockerbie, and of course stay tuned for more of these classic and vintage racers right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.